Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And I'm very happy to have you here today. And if you'd like to take part in the conversation, you can type your comments or questions into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and they should appear in my chat room where I can respond to them. And if you have followed this program, you'll know that we do tend to have a lot of interaction with our viewers, and that does tend to drive conversation. And our conversations can end up all over the place. It doesn't necessarily matter where I started in terms of where it finishes. And today, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I'm doing that are new to me. And one of them is I've started on my Patreon a monthly seminar. And the first seminar is going to be on the nature and practice of magic. And hello to Jesse in the chat room. Good to see you. And these seminars will be available to people who are members of my Patreon at that tier level, and also to people who people outside of Patreon who wish to buy a ticket. And you can find that ticket at revdonlewis.com, and I've already sold the first one, which pleases me. And that seminar will be June 24th. And all the information is there at Correllian.com. Let me remind myself quickly of the time. Not Correllian.com, CorrellianPublishing.com. And we will have a wonderful conversation about the nature of magic and how it works, why it works. And as with everything else I do, exactly what all we cover will depend in part on what people ask, what people want to focus on. But I figure the biggest part to understanding magic is understanding your relationship with the universe. And that will be Saturday, June 24th at 1 p.m. Central or 2 p.m. Eastern. So an hour after when this broadcast will be, but that will be a Saturday, so I won't have done this one that day. I think it will be a lovely conversation. Hopefully I'll have the boxes taken care of here in the office before then. And another thing I'm doing is returning to regular readings. And in fact, I started my day today with a reading for one of our regular viewers. It was a lovely experience. And I'm hoping to do many more readings. So if you're interested in a reading, you can contact me by messenger or in any other way, and we can set one up for you. And if you're not familiar with my readings, I do clairvoyance, I do tarot, and I also can do past life readings, which is a separate discipline. And it's all a matter of what you would like. The way I like to do readings is I just start and see what the universe has to say. And then if you have more specific questions, you can ask them. But very often, the thing that's most important to the person will come out immediately without ever having to be asked. And it can come out in very interesting ways. When I do clairvoyance, I'm very visual in how I receive my messages. And some of the pictures can be quite interesting. It can be a lot. It can be a lot of fun from that aspect alone. Now, I will say that when I do readings, I usually don't remember them afterward. So you want to make sure that you remember, because I probably will not. The only times that I remember readings after I've done them is perhaps if we discuss it immediately and it enters my conscious mind. But you don't really do a reading from your conscious mind. You do it from your higher self. And because it's not your information, it doesn't really stay in your mind. It passes through. When you get a clairvoyant message, what happens is that message comes down through your crown chakra and out through your mouth by way of your mind. Hello, Michael in the chat room. Good to see you. And it gains its words and even the way that concepts are expressed through your mind. And so the range of messages you can transmit depends in part on the range of your mind. If you do not have a word for it, it can be very difficult to bring something through. It can be like feeling your way through pea soup. If you cannot embrace the concept, it can be very difficult to bring the message through. So the more that you know, the more that you study, the more you familiarize yourself with different ideas, the more messages you can effectively bring through. Hello to Bradley in the chat room. Good to see you, Bradley. And hello to Brian in the chat room. Good to see you, Brian. And interestingly, Plutarch, one of the great figures of the ancient world, one of the great writers on ancient spirituality, I believe Plutarch was asked why the messages of the oracles of Delphi were no longer as good as they had formerly been. And his response, which of course at first glance sounds very classist, was that previously women of high social status and education had taken the job as oracle, but over time they were no longer interested. And people of a more lowly origin had taken the role. And of course, phrase it that way, and it's quite an objectionable statement. But if you consider that what he was actually trying to say is that the earlier oracles had had a broader field of experience, a broader education, it actually makes sense. When the role devolved to women who did not have a broad background, they could only speak to what they knew. Even though they were bringing through messages, those messages could only use the concepts they were familiar with, the words that they knew. This is something people often do not understand about psychic reading, and it's very important. Occasionally, people will seem to bring through ideas they had no familiarity with, but that's because they had enough concepts that it could be built. My favorite example of this involves my favorite reader, Rosemary Fletcher, who was probably the best reader I have known. And she did a reading for Sir Edward once about the projects that he was involved with, and she predicted that he would be doing a daily newspaper distributed around the world. And he thought, and she thought, and we thought she was talking about a paper and print newspaper being mailed around the world, because at that time that was what you would normally think. But within just a few years, everything had changed because of the internet. And that newspaper, the Daily Spell, was going out around the world every day, just as she predicted, but in an electronic format that she had not had the concept for. So she got it right, but she didn't have a way to say it. And this is something that I think happens often with readers. And it's very important to understand. Now, one of the things I'm going to be doing in coming months is teaching about the psychic arts more intensively than before. And this is one of the things that's very important, I think, for people to know. And again, that is that to be a truly effective psychic reader, you need to have a wide field of reference and a flexible mind. You absolutely must not bring judgment to your readings while you're doing them. You must simply be an open book that the message passes through. You can analyze it to your heart's content afterward, but when you're bringing it through, you must simply be open and without judgment, because you may think what you're getting is ridiculous. You may not understand it, but when you brought it out, it may suddenly become completely clear, or it may be clear to your client, but not clear to you. Hello to Janet in the chat room. Good to see you, Janet. And in fact, I told the story earlier today when I was doing the reading that I did about how maybe 20 years ago, I had read for a woman who was specifically looking for a message from her deceased father. And the only thing I could bring through was the image of a teddy bear. And I thought this was the most cliched thing imaginable. I was embarrassed to say, well, I see a teddy bear. Because obviously a teddy bear represents love and comfort and very positive. But I was thinking, well, surely there's a message here to be delivered. Well, I did say, I'm seeing a teddy bear. And lo and behold, that was their agreed upon symbol to show that it was actually him speaking. If I had not said it, I would have done everyone a great disservice, even though I did not understand. That's what I was seeing. And that's a good example of why you have to say what you get, whether you understand it or not, and why you must not bring judgment to it. I brought the judgment to it that I thought it was not an appropriate message, but I had the wisdom to go ahead and say it anyway, and it was the most appropriate message. Another one I did maybe 30 years ago, and I remember these because they were outstanding examples, but I was reading for a woman, and I was getting the most nonsensical images. Um, I was getting microphones of the sort that singing performers used at that time. And I mean, they were rather large microphones with substantial heads that you will remember if you're my age, but would have no context for today. Um, and I was seeing babies, and I could not get anything more until I talked about these two things that I was seeing together. Well, it turns out she was a nurse who regularly did um, sonograms. The tests they do with babies where they use a wand to get an image. Um, but I had no context for that. I had no children at that time. I was quite young. But she knew immediately what I was talking about. If I had not given the message, I would have done her a disservice. Hello to Brenda in the chat room. So even if as a psychic reader, you're getting something that makes no sense to you, or even seems bad to you, you still need to say it because it may have a totally different meaning to that client than what you're thinking. And in fact, you should not be thinking at all as a reader. You should just be bringing through. And that's one of the hardest things about reading. You know, I will say to you that reading and even the most advanced channeling and oracle work is really the easiest thing in the world once you know that is the case. But learning it can be very difficult because we have been taught very different ways of looking at things. It seems like such a profound skill. You think there's so much you have to do. The truth is, if you can relax into it, that's all that's required. And little children often have this quite naturally because they don't have the idea yet that it's a difficult skill to acquire. Hello to Ivy in the chat room who says, hello, Reverend Don, you're absolutely right. And yes, it's true. And it's true of everything in the psychic and magical realm. We make it so hard and it's actually so easy. But you can't tell a person that until they've experienced it. When I was learning how to do channeling, we'll use the term channeling, we could say mediumship, we could say oracle work, however you want to phrase it. When I was learning to do this, it seemed terribly difficult. And as I got closer and closer to it, the guides were saying, you know, this is really the simplest thing in the world. All you have to do is fall into it. And I was using other things. I was being taught to do it using other tools. But when I finally was able to do it, I immediately understood what they had meant all along. It was as simple as just letting it come through. Later, they said to me, you know, you could see us if you wanted to. And I had never done anything to develop that skill. And they said, you know, just do it. And I tried it, and I allowed it to come through, and I found that I could visually receive them as much as I'd been orally receiving them, without ever having intentionally developed that skill, because it's natural to us humans. What we do is we get convinced that it's our imagination, we shut it off. And of course, certain things are our imagination. If you were to ask me, how can you tell the difference between what's psychic and what's imagination? I would say you can't always. But generally, it's what you seek versus what you create. I was asked once how I could be certain that I wasn't simply schizophrenic, because my late father was schizophrenic. And my answer to this is that I worked hard to develop this skill, even within the context of what I was just saying about it being simple when I learned it, but learning it was hard. And I do not do it almost ever without intentionally going into it. That's not schizophrenia. Schizophrenia comes on you whether you want it or not. This was a skill I had to learn, and which I must employ in order to use. I've had people ask me, do you see things as you walk down the street? No, I do not. I see things when I enter into a trance. If I don't do that, there's nothing like this in my life. With a few strategic exceptions, but very, very rare. And I think that's partly because it's important to me to know that difference between what might be imagination or hallucination versus what is actually psychic. I know there are other people for whom that wall is less clear, and they will see things unbidden on a regular basis. I am not one of them, but I'm more comfortable not being in that position. I like the fact that I switch it on and switch it off as I need it. Now, Bradley says, sometimes it's hard to trust yourself, let go, and release your expectations of what's going to happen. And that's exactly true. That's what makes all of this hard to do, and the only thing that makes it hard to do. In life, we want to have so much mental control over everything, and we're taught to do that, that to realize we could let go and allow things to flow is actually very difficult for us. And Jessie says, I try to take those playful cues from my 8-year-old. She plays in space all the time and has brought forth some pretty profound ideas from it. And yes, Jessie, this is a wonderful example. Little children very often are highly psychically open before they're taught to close it down. Now, I've been told that the process of coming into adolescence also has a natural effect of dampening it. I don't know if that's true or if it's society that does it. But if we look through history, it does seem that only certain adults maintain that ability. So I think maybe adolescence does play a role, but children are often quite open. And um, I can remember freely using skills as a child that I later had to learn as an adult. Um, but as a child, there was very little separation there. Um, I cannot remember a time, for example, when I could not visualize. Although I didn't have to go back and learn that, I never lost it. But I didn't have to learn what it meant later, how to use it later, but I could always do it. And there are other people who are completely unable to do it. That actually amazed me to learn that anyone could not see with the mind's eye in the same way that I could naturally, could not visualize something in realistic form. But there are people who do not have that skill. So I assume it's something that I have developed in past lives and brought through, and that I would assume all humans are in the process of developing through their incarnations, but not all have quite got there. I was recently made aware that not everyone has an internal dialogue, which just utterly amazes me, since I've always had one. And most people I know have had one, but apparently not everyone does. And it's important to realize we're not all in the same place. There's great difference between people, great difference between not only where we are, but where we start in life. And that when we work with people, when we try to teach them these skills, we have to remember not everyone is starting from the same place, and we must meet them where we find them. We cannot take the point of view, oh, you don't know as much as I do, I can't work with you, or, oh, you don't already have this background, well, I'm not going to waste my time with you. That's not what we're here for. That's not what teaching is about. Teaching is about helping everyone to move forward who wishes and is willing to move forward. And sometimes that will require working in different ways for different people. What I learned, for example, after publishing the Correllian degree lessons, on that subject of visualizations, there were many people who could not visualize, but they could feel the energy perfectly well. Well, it doesn't matter if you can visualize, if you can feel the energy perfectly well. And that's what I learned to work with. If you can't see it, feel it. And if you can feel it, you have no problem. And I also found that many of the people who did that within a short time could also see it. But they had had a mental block that because they could not already see it, they would never be able to. When they started to work with the energy by feeling it, the ability to visualize came quickly. And of course, this will be some people, not all people. We're all different. But children often do have this ability to bring through. One of the things you read all the time is children who talk about their past lives, which I think is quite fascinating. And there are cases where people claim to have validated some of these stories. For example, there was a case here in Illinois of a little girl who talked all the time about her previous life in a town not far from where she lived. And eventually, I don't remember now whether it was with the idea of disproving it to her or, in fact, proving it. Her family took her to this town to look around, and she said, "That was my house." And they went and they met the family in the house, and all the details the little girl was talking about matched the deceased mother. And she went on to have a lifelong relationship with that family, in addition to her new family. It's a very famous story in southern Illinois. I visited the house. I could barely get around in it because it was built for a smaller scale of human than myself, but that's often the case with certain older buildings. Um, but it was very interesting. And but you hear a lot of stories like that. There are some famous stories from India where people went in search of the past life their child was talking about and in fact found it. There's there are famous cases from more modern times, from more contemporary times in, say, Europe, where people have done the same thing. And of course, most past lives you can't track down. The most important thing, though, to remember about past lives and working with past lives is that that really doesn't matter. What matters about past lives is their spiritual and emotional reality. That's what you're going to work with if you work with them. Um, the historicity is a minor concern in doing that kind of work. One of the things that happens when people do past life regressions is that very often they will see anomalies that do not fit the history. But this comes back to what we were saying earlier about how you get a message. It has to come through this mind, because this is the gateway to your current consciousness. And sometimes it just can't bring through all of those historical details. And so you'll get some weird things. I remember there is a famous novel based on past life. And she talks about the ancient Egyptians having nightlights in the form of glass jars filled with fireflies. This is not, to the best of my knowledge, a historical thing. It's not even a possible thing, given the glassmaking skill in Egypt at the time. Having said that, that doesn't mean her memory was inaccurate, merely imperfect. And I think we always have to assume that our memory of past lives may contain imperfection, because our memory of this life contains imperfection. Hello to Deb in the chat room. Good to see you, Deb. When I remember things out of my life, they're not always perfect. It depends on how much I was paying attention at the time. Sometimes other things have happened. So I can hardly expect a past life memory to be exactly perfect. And hello to Natalie in the chat room. And Natalie says, my son tells us all the time how he looked upon us before his birth. And this is another important thing. You know, people often say, I didn't choose my parents. But when you do spiritual work, that isn't what you find. You find that, yes, you very much did, or at least your family. And often were around them well before you were born. And I found that in doing my own work. And I could remember that fairly early, but I also remember having that told to me very early, that the soul is often around its parents before it's born. And I totally do believe that. And I think that's one reason why sometimes children will know things that they should not know about their parents' relationship before they were born. Or there will be other aspects that will come through that did not happen in their lifetime, but which they have obviously observed somehow. It's because their soul was around. The soul is a very complex thing. And one of my future seminars will certainly deal with the soul. One of the things that we encounter in advanced metaphysical work is that we, in fact, have multiple incarnations, not only chronologically, in terms of past lives and future lives, but also temporally, we have parallel incarnations at the same time, because the soul is not just a larger version of ourself. It's not a larger version of the brain. It is its own thing. And it can have many lives going. If you are familiar with basic teachings of metaphysics, you should be familiar with the idea that time is an illusion. Once you consider that, you'll understand why the soul can have many incarnations, because time is not relevant to it, at least not in the way that time is relevant to us. And my understanding is that time as we experience it is largely a feature of gravity, which I don't fully understand, but that is my understanding from those who do. And hello to Jason in the chat room. And Jason says, I've met one incarnation of me once. I dated her for a while. And yes, this will happen. If you do advanced incarnational work, you will meet other incarnations of your own soul. I have. Um, and they offered a lot of insight, some of which I'm still digesting. But I've encountered a few other me's. And what I've mostly observed from them are aspects of my shadow that need to be dealt with. Although they certainly had many, many other aspects that didn't necessarily offer me lessons. But I think when you meet other incarnations of yourself, that is one of the things you will see, things you need to work on in you. But yes, you will meet them. I remember Lady Crystal had an exercise for seeing into other parallel lives that your soul was having that involved scrying in a mirror. And she found herself tapping into the life of an artist whose livelihood was art, and who had a particular description involving red hair. And it was after this Lady Crystal decided to dye her hair red for a number of years. Her natural color is dark like mine. But for quite a while, she lived as a redhead, partly because of working with this parallel life. And of course, she too is an artist, but she's never made it her profession. Well, years later, a decade later, I'm in Chicago, and I happen to come across an artist who's relatively famous in that area for her metaphysical artwork, and has red hair, and reminded me immediately of Lady Crystal. And I put two and two together fairly quick to realize this was the life she'd been looking at, and Spirit had chosen to introduce me to it, which I certainly shared with her, and she thought that was fascinating. She never met the lady, but I did. And it was very interesting also to see the artwork, which is very evocative. But I will not name the artist because that would not be appropriate, not least because none of this was ever discussed with that person, and they are their own separate person. I've met a number of other incarnations of my own soul, I believe, but I won't name any of them either for the same reason. But as I say, I learned a lot from them. A few were, well, I don't know if I want to say more or less advanced, but I've met people who might be described as either, who I felt were manifestations of my own soul. But as I say, the most important thing I took away from it were the things I needed to work on in myself. Not only that, one of the earliest spiritual teachings that I recall was my grandmother's teaching that if when you have ended this life you did not like it, you can repeat it. And this is very much something that I believe and teach. And I also believe that you don't actually have to wait till the end of the life. So that in addition to having these parallel incarnations, this incarnation itself has more than one version. And you can move between them if you learn how. So if you don't like quite where you're at, you can shift. But that's more than a half-hour discussion. And it's something that I've done on occasion. And in the end, I think that is the key to all of incarnation, that we are a point of consciousness that is constantly shifting. And in everyday life, we do this all the time. We move from one probability to another, one parallel to another. And in the end, the same energy runs through everything. But it depends how you're looking at it and where you're looking at it, what you're going to see. It's kind of like a string of lights. You can see it as a single entity, a string of lights, or you can see it as many different lights. And let's say it's a string of blinking lights where the lights change color. You could think of each color separately too. It's all in how you're looking at it. And people who are terribly literal find this a very frustrating concept. But I think it really is the key to understanding the greater nature of things. So with that, I see we filled our half hour. I thank you very much for joining me. And, I love spending this time with you. I love all of you. It's so nice to see you every day, and I hope you'll join me again tomorrow. And with that, let us close with our prayer, and I will look forward to seeing you again. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, help us to keep our flexibility. And if we've lost it, help us to regain it. Help us to dance nimbly through life, taking advantage of all the things that surround us. Help us to embrace the totality of existence and not to shut ourselves away in boxes, as so often is our tendency. Help us to embrace the totality and beauty of being. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you this and we thank you with great love and with respect. Knowing you are always with us, yet from respect, we thank you and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you, I love you all, and with much love, may you be blessed now and always. And we'll see you